If you've ever looked at a photograph from the 1880s and noticed that the women seem to have a massive shelf jutting out from their lower backs, you're not imagining things. That bump was real. Well, the bump was real. What was underneath it was basically a cage made of steel wire strapped to a woman's waist. So why on earth were millions of women walking around Victorian-era London and Paris and New York with what looked like a birdcage bolted to their backsides? Turns out the answer involves deadly fires, a fashion dictator from a small town in England, and a centuries-long obsession with making the human body into something it very much is not. Let's start with what you're actually looking at in those old photographs. The thing creating that bump is called a bustle. And, at its most basic, a bustle is just padding or a frame worn underneath a skirt to push the fabric out at the back. Think of it like a shelf for your dress. Some bustles were simple cushions stuffed with horsehair. Others were elaborate cages made from bent steel wire, almost like a lobster trap designed for the human rear end. The fancier versions had springs and hinges so a woman could actually sit down without the whole structure collapsing or, worse, flipping up behind her head. The bustle created a silhouette where the front of the dress was relatively flat and the back exploded outward into this dramatic cascade of draped fabric, pleats, ribbons, and bows. In the 1880s especially, some bustles projected almost horizontally from the body. Fashion historians describe it as a shelf. You could practically set a teacup on it, which, looking back, was either incredibly elegant or incredibly impractical, probably both. But the bustle didn't appear out of nowhere, and this is where it gets interesting. Before the bustle, Victorian women wore something arguably more extreme, the crinoline. If you've ever seen one of those enormous bell-shaped skirts from the 1850s and 1860s, where it looks like the woman is standing inside a tent, that's a crinoline. It was a cage made from steel hoops connected by vertical tapes, worn under the skirt to hold it out in every direction. Some crinolines extended 6 feet across. Women couldn't fit through standard doorways. They knocked things off shelves just by turning around. Getting into a carriage was a whole production. And then there were the fires. Open flames were everywhere in Victorian homes. Fireplaces, candles, oil lamps, gas lighting. A crinoline turned a woman into a walking fire hazard. The steel frame held yards and yards of flammable cotton and gauze away from the body, and if the edge of that fabric brushed a flame, the whole structure acted like a wick. The fire would race up and around the cage before the woman could escape. Roughly 3,000 women died in crinoline-related fires in England between the 1850s and 1860s. Among them were the wife of the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and 2 of Oscar Wilde's half-sisters. Female servants were especially vulnerable, working near kitchen fires with their wide skirts swaying over open hearths. Other women who rushed in to help often caught fire themselves, their own crinolines igniting from the flames. One London magazine suggested that every woman wearing a crinoline should be followed by a footman carrying a bucket of water. I mean, think about that for a second. A garment so dangerous that people were half-seriously recommending a dedicated fire brigade as a fashion accessory. The crinoline didn't die overnight, but by the late 1860s, the silhouette had already started to change. The fullness of the skirt began shifting backward. Instead of a perfect circle of fabric around the body, the front got flatter while the back got bigger. And this is where one man had an outsized influence on what millions of women would strap to their bodies for the next 2 decades. Charles Frederick Worth was born in a small town in Lincolnshire, England, in 1825. He started working in a fabric shop at age 12 and eventually moved to Paris, where he opened his own dressmaking house in 1858. Through a connection to Princess Metternich, the wife of the Austrian ambassador, Worth gained the patronage of Empress Eugenie, the wife of Napoleon III. And from that point on, he essentially dictated what fashionable women across Europe and America would wear. Worth is often called the father of haute couture. He was the first designer to show collections on live models, the first to sew his label into garments, and one of the first to understand that fashion wasn't just about clothes, It was about creating desire. He didn't just respond to what women wanted. He told them what they wanted. And in the 1870s, what he told them they wanted was the bustle. Worth helped transition the fashion world from the full crinoline cage to the half crinoline, and then to the bustle itself. The first bustle era, from about 1870 to 1876, featured a soft, rounded shape at the back. Dresses had cascading drapes of fabric, apron-like fronts, and elaborate trains that trailed behind. The look was ornate, but still had a flowing, almost romantic quality. But this wasn't the version most people picture when they think of the Victorian bustle. Most people never heard about this earlier, softer version. The real spectacle came in the second bustle period, starting around 1883. Worth and other designers brought the bustle back with a vengeance after a brief period in the late 1870s when the silhouette had slimmed down. This time, the bustle wasn't soft or draped. It was a rigid, geometric shelf made from steel caging, projecting almost horizontally from the small of the back. The French called it the crinolette because its engineering was similar to the old crinoline cage, just concentrated in one spot. Dresses were built around this structure with tight bodices, high collars, and skirts that hugged the front of the legs before erupting into this dramatic rear projection. The effect was striking. From the front, a woman looked almost modern, slim, and tailored. From the side, she looked like she was carrying a small table behind her. All right, so here's where this stops being just a fashion history lesson and starts being something bigger. The bustle wasn't random, it was a signal. In Victorian society, your clothes told everyone exactly who you were, how much money your family had, and whether or not you had to work for a living. A massive bustle dress required yards of expensive fabric, sometimes 20 or 30 yards for a single gown. It required a dressmaker or, if you were wealthy enough, a couture house in Paris. It required time to put on, time to arrange, and someone to help you with all of it. You couldn't do manual labor in a bustle dress. You could barely climb stairs, and that was the point. The bustle announced that the woman wearing it didn't need to move efficiently. She had servants, she had leisure, she had money. The more impractical the garment, the louder the message. But this wasn't just about money. The bustle turned the female body into architecture. The corset cinched the waist, the bustle extended the back, and the overall effect created a silhouette that had almost nothing to do with the actual human shape underneath. The body became raw material for a cultural ideal, something to be sculpted and reshaped season by season according to whatever the fashion houses in Paris decided was beautiful that year. If you're wondering how that's different from anything we do today, the answer is that it really isn't. The specific shapes change, but the impulse to reshape the body into something artificial has been constant for centuries. Padded shoulders in the 1940s, cinched waists in the 1950s, heroin chic in the 1990s, Brazilian butt lifts in the 2020s. The bustle is just the Victorian version of something we've never stopped doing. The bustle disappeared almost completely by 1890, replaced by the sleeker princess line silhouette that let dresses follow the natural contours of the body more closely. After 20 years of strapping steel cages and horsehair cushions to their backs, women just stopped. Fashion moved on, the way it always does, cycling from one extreme to the next. So the bump on their backs was a cage, a cushion, and a social statement all wrapped in silk and ribbon. It was a solution to a problem that didn't exist, designed to create a shape that nature never intended, promoted by a man from a small English town who moved to Paris and told the world what beauty looked like. And the wildest part? At the time, nobody thought it was strange. It was just what you wore. Every era's fashion makes perfect sense to the people living through it and looks completely absurd to everyone who comes after. The Victorians would probably look at skinny jeans and feel exactly the same way. If you're still watching, you're clearly the kind of person who appreciates a good deep dive into weird history. Subscribe, because I cover stuff like this every week. And if you want to go further down this rabbit hole, click the video on screen right now. I think you'll like it.